Well, hello, it's Miss Gina, and you're at Gina's Planet, and I'm so glad you're here. It's time for story time. We are on Christopher Robin, Chapter 4. That's where we left off. So we're going to pick right back up where we left off. We're going to dive right in. It's Chapter 4. And there's my friend Pooh. I have to pull out my footstool to make me tall. Okay, it didn't help. This is very good, Winnie the Pooh said through a mouthful of honey. Very good. Are you sure that you wouldn't like some, Christopher Robin? Christopher looked around the kitchen counter. It was covered in empty honey jars, small jars, large jars, decorative jars, and plain jars. It hadn't mattered what form the honey came in. As soon as Winnie the Pooh found honey, it was eaten. I don't blame him. But while the bear seemed to be completely unbothered by his presence in London, or the very close encounter with Cecil that they had only narrowly escaped, Christopher was the opposite. He was, put simply, freaking out. He had spent the past 30 minutes while Pooh ate trying to wrap his mind or his head around everything. He didn't know what was going on or why it was happening, but Pooh was most certainly real and most certainly there. And while the bear looked slightly worse for wear, with his fur a bit threadbare and the pads on his paws a bit shabby, he was still most undoubtedly the bear from Christopher's childhood. Pooh, he asked the question that had really been perplexing him popping out. How did you recognize me after all these years? Oh, you haven't changed at all, Pooh said, not looking up from the honey jar. I've changed tremendously, Christopher exclaimed. It was true. He had been a boy when he had left the 100-acre wood, a young, innocent boy who'd believed in the impossible and hadn't spent his days worrying about cutting costs and finding the most efficient way to manage a team. The bear shook his head. Not right here, he said, reaching up and motioning toward Christopher's eyes as he did so. Honey smeared across the man's cheeks and dripped down onto the ground. It's still you looking out, he said. Christopher sighed. Wouldn't it be nice if that were true? But despite what the lovable and kind-hearted bear said, he had changed. And as he winced at the puddles of honey on the floor and the mess that Pooh made as he jumped off his stool directly into the honey, he knew the changes weren't for the better. The Christopher Robin Pooh had known in the 100-acre wood would have jumped right in the honey puddle with his friend. Instead, the mess made him cringe, and he found himself rushing over to the sink to wipe his own sticky face clean before following the bear. Unaware that his paws were trailing honey, Pooh, who was finally feeling full and therefore more energized, began to explore the London townhouse. He wandered out of the kitchen and into the dining room before entering the library. He raised a paw and ran it along the book spines as he walked. This place is very big, he observed. Do you live here all alone? Christopher frantically wiped all the books. No, he said, shaking his head. No. Then he paused. Well, right now, yes, but usually no. My wife and daughter are in the country for the weekend. It felt funny, he realized, to tell the bear that he had a wife and child. Why aren't Rewind. Why aren't you with them? Pooh asked. The revelation that his friend was now a parent and a husband did not seem to faze the bear. As he waited for an answer, Pooh walked into the drawing room and right onto the fancy rug Evelyn had spent a tidy sum on. The rug began to drag behind him, stuck to the bottom of Pooh's foot. I had to stay for work, Christopher answered. Why aren't you in the country? Is more the question as he spoke. He reached down and yanked the rug free of Pooh's foot, sending the bear tumbling forward. Pooh landed head first in the brass horn part of the family's gramophone. A record began to play. Because, Pooh said, his voice now muffled by the musical contraption, there's nobody anywhere, and I looked everywhere. Christopher lifted the gramophone off the bear's face. Pooh looked back at him, unbothered by his run-in with the instrument, but clearly upset about his missing friends. I'm afraid I don't know where they've gone, Christopher said softly, and even if I did, what can I do? I'm sorry, Pooh. He let out an involuntary yawn, his eyes moving toward the clock on the desk. It's getting late and I'm tired. So the sound of snoring filled the room and he turned. Pooh was fast asleep on a chair. Walking over, Christopher looked down at his childhood friend. He looked so peaceful and sweet without a care in the world. I wonder when the last time I slept like that was, Christopher thought as he gently lifted Pooh in his arms and made his way upstairs to Madeline's room. With one hand, he drew back the duvet, then lowered the bear into bed. Pooh mumbled in his sleep before turning on his side and resuming his soft snoring. For a moment, Christopher just stood there. He couldn't remember the last time he had just watched his own daughter sleep. He was always so tired himself when he got home. Or maybe it never occurred to him to take the time to enjoy the innocent peace of a sleeping child. Time does go by fast. And while Pooh was technically not a child, he was not certainly innocent. As he watched now, Christopher was flooded with thoughts of his own childhood, of the wonderful feeling of falling into bed after a full day of playing in the woods with Pooh and the others, of snuggling down under the covers to listen to his mother read him a story. His eyes drifted over toward Madeline's bookcase, and as they did, they landed on the book that Madeline had found in the attic. Tiptoeing over, Christopher opened the box and peered inside. There were a few acorns, a twig, and a small piece of cloth he thought might have belonged to a blanket. But what filled most of the box were drawings. One by one, he pulled out the faded papers, a smile tugging at his lips as familiar faces looked back at him. Of course, there were lots of Pooh, but there were also drawings of Eeyore, his expression grumpy, and little Piglet. There were pictures of Rabbit and Owl, drawings of Tigger, Kanga, and Roo. With each picture, the memory of the 100-acre wood grew stronger, as did his memories of all the adventures he had gone on with his friends. A grumble from Pooh startled Christopher. Shaken, Christopher dropped the pictures he was looking at. It fluttered to the ground. Deciding it was well and truly time for bed, Christopher made his way over to the door. Turning off the light, he took one last look at his friend. Good night, Winnie the Pooh. He whispered, I've missed you. I've missed you. Missed you, Winnie the Pooh. Heading into his own room, Christopher climbed into bed and turned off the light. It had been a long day, and while he thought sleep might be impossible, with all the thoughts running through his head, he was asleep before his head hit the pillow. A loud rumble jolted Christopher awake. rubbing at his eyes, blurry from from sleep. He heard the rumble again, louder this time. What is that? He thought. Trying to make sense of the noise. They weren't near any train lines, and he hadn't heard of any construction happening in the area. The rumble came again, even louder this time. If it hadn't been for the comfortable feeling of the mattress underneath him, Christopher would have thought he was back on the battlefield. Christopher groaned as his vision cleared, and he saw that the sound was not, in fact, coming from the warplanes soaring above, but rather from Winnie the Pooh. It seemed that in the middle of the night, the bear had climbed out of Madeline's bed and crawled into his. The bear's face was smushed against Christopher's shoulder. Another loud rumble woke up the sleeping bear, and he hopped up, turning so that his bottom was now directly in Christopher's face. Pooh stretched. Time to make myself hungry with my stoutness exercise, he announced. Clearly, the change of scenery did not bother Pooh enough to upset the morning routine. Up, down, down. Each time he bent over, the bear's bottom would swing in front of Christopher, and his belly would rumble. You're already hungry, Pooh, Christopher said, trying to avoid a face full of bear bottom. Pooh paused. Hearing his tummy rumble, he nodded. Oh, yes, he agreed, hopping off the bed. Christopher flopped back against the pillows and watched as the bear waddled out of the room and disappeared down the stairs. For one blissful moment, peace and quiet descended over the master bedroom. Crash! Christopher jumped out of bed as another loud crashing sound emerged from downstairs, not even bothering to tie his robe. He flew down the stairs and skidded into the kitchen. The source of the crash was immediately obvious. One of the kitchen shelves had come crashing down off the wall. Tins and jars were strewn all over the floor, and standing in the middle of it all, looking as innocent as a newborn baby, was Pooh. Your ladder is broken, he said. Your ladder is broken. Oh dear. Christopher shook his head as he bent over and began picking up the mess Pooh had made. It's not a ladder, Pooh, he said. It was a shelf. That explains why it was no good for climbing, Pooh said, nodding. I don't have time to muck about, Christopher said, sighing. He dumped a few broken pieces of glass jars into the garbage. I should be working, finding a solution. Then, more to himself than to the bear, he added, even though I think it may be impossible. He then opened a jar of honey, which was a surprise find to Christopher because he had thought the bear had eaten the entire supply the night before. Pooh shrugged. People say nothing is impossible, he said, stuffing his paw into the jar. But I do nothing every day. Oh, Pooh, that's not, oh, never mind, Christopher said, waving his hand. Never mind. He knew it was useless to try to explain himself or his motivations to the bear, but he found himself doing it anyway. Look, I'm an adult now with responsibilities. I can't be distracted, which is why we really need to get you home. But how? Pooh asked. Christopher felt a small pang of guilt. He realized Pooh had come to him for help and that he was failing his old friend terribly. But he couldn't waste the weekend. He had specifically not gone away to be with his own family so that he could work. Getting caught up in Pooh's misadventures was a waste of time, plain and simple. Still, perhaps he should try to help. Crash! Another shelf fell to the floor at that moment, dropping a sack of flour to the ground and sending a plume of white powder up into the air and all over Christopher. No! He had been right the first time, picking Pooh up and putting him under his arm. Christopher began to head upstairs. He needed to get dressed. Then they were heading to Sussex to get Pooh back to the 100-acre wood. Then we'll be on chapter 5. But I want to go back in time here. Let's see. We didn't start with the preface or the prologue. So we're going to go back to the author's notes and the prologue. Author's notes. It says, as a child, I spent many afternoons lost in the 100-acre wood, caught up in adventures with a silly old bear named Pooh and his best friend, Christopher Robin. The world of the wood was as real to me as my own backyard. I could picture Pooh's home with its large armoire full of honey pots, and felt as though I myself had knocked on Piglet's door on many occasions. I loved Eeyore with his droopy eyes and his pessimistic view on life, though at the time I had no idea what pessimistic meant. I just thought it was rather funny that the donkey could never see how much he was loved or how great things were, a lesson I remind myself often in my older age, and wanted a hug from Kanga and to bounce along with Roo and Tigger. Rabbit and Owl, with their more serious natures, understanding of the larger world, always intimidated me to a degree, but became the characters I saw most in the adult figures in my life. The 100-acre wood was a wonderful place to spend my time, and generations of children before and after me have also lost themselves among the woods and its hodgepodge of animals. What child hasn't at some point or another believed in that innocent, wholehearted way that the stuffed animals they loved the most could come to life and be their companions or adventures, that they could provide comfort when faced with the inevitable sad or frightening moments of life. Pooh was that hope come true, and even now I believe in him and what he represented. I believe in the silly old bear who could, in his simple way, always find the silver lining and bring the world to right when it got knocked off kilter. As Pooh himself so wisely said, life is a journey to be experienced, not a problem to be solved. Enjoy the adventure. E. Rudnick. And there's Pooh. You can't stay in your corner of the forest waiting for others to come to you. You have to go to them sometimes. A. Milne. Here's our prologue, in which Christopher Robin and Pooh come to an enchanted place, and we leave them there. It was, as it most usually was, a beautiful day in the 100-acre wood. The sky was blue, unblemished by clouds. The air was sweet, touched by a hint of honey that wafted from a familiar bear's pot. And a gentle breeze kissed the cheeks of the friends who had gathered around a picnic table. But while the setting was idyllic and lent itself to happy thoughts, the expressions on the faces of the friends were rather, sad. Looking around the table, Winnie the Pooh tried to ignore the rumbling, grumbling sound coming from his tummy. He wasn't positive, but he had a feeling that now was not the time to mention he was hungry. Even if they were at a picnic table, which in his experience was usually a place people picnicked, and picnics usually involve food. His tummy grumbled again. Picnics do usually involve food, my experience. We all know why we're here. Rabbit's serious voice brought a quick stop to thoughts of food. Pooh looked over and watched as Rabbit walked to the head of the picnic table. I have asked my friend Eeyore. He paused and nodded. In the direction of the gray donkey, whose head was hanging down, as usual, I have asked him to propose a resolution. Pooh cocked his head. Resolution? He did not like when Rabbit used such big words. He opened his mouth to ask what a resolution was. But before he could, Eeyore lumbered over to stand by Rabbit. He placed the piece of paper in the middle of the table and then proceeded to straighten it out for a very long time. Finally, he cleared his throat and began to read. Christopher Robin is going, he read, his voice slow and deep, as usual, devoid of any happiness. At least I think he is. Where? Nobody knows, but he is going. Eeyore paused and his heavy brows furrowed as he looked over the words on the page. I mean, he goes. He corrected himself, then he went on. Do we care? We do, very much. Anyhow, we send our love. The end. The sullen donkey stopped speaking and slowly lifted his head from the paper. The other animals were silent. Pooh was looking beyond him at the large banner they had hung above the picnic table. The words, Farewell, Christopher Robin, were written across it, now quite straight in a mishmash of colors. Eeyore let out a long, slow sigh. If anyone wants to clap, he said finally, with little enthusiasm in his voice, now is the time to do it. As if on cue, Christopher Robin himself walked into the clearing. As if on cue, Christopher Robin has now appeared. That's a lovely poem, Eeyore, he said in a kind voice. The 7-year-old had been hanging back at the edge of the clearing until Eeyore had finished. Now he brushed back his auburn bangs, which had grown long and shaggy over the summer months, and looked around at all his friends. He felt a lump in his throat. He loved the odd collection of animals more than anything in the world. He loved sweet, innocent Piglet with his squeaky voice and fear of, well, everything. There was Kanga and her Joey Roo and Tigger, who even during this somber occasion couldn't stop moving. Owl and Rabbit had remained serious the entire time, while Eeyore had managed to make the going away poem sound even sadder than it was supposed to be. And of course, there was his best friend, Winnie the Pooh. He was going to miss them all so much. They had spent so many long days together playing in the woods behind his family's house. Without them around, the summer would have been painfully slow and painfully lonely. Mother and father were not exactly fun playmates. Knowing that the others were looking at him intently, eager to see if he liked his banner and poem, Christopher tried hard to smile, but he could tell that the others knew he was sad, especially Pooh. It's just too bad it's over, the bear said, pulling his red shirt down over his belly. I would have liked to go for a while longer. With a nod of agreement, Christopher Robin walked over to the picnic table. His shirt and shorts, which had fit at the beginning of the summer, were now too small, and he found himself pulling them down in a similar fashion to how Pooh tugged on his clothes. Although Christopher knew that Pooh's reason for a tight shirt wasn't so much growing up as growing rounder from the abundant honey he ate. Jumping up onto the picnic table, he was closer in height to Christopher Robin. Piglet approached the boy. Even now, after countless hours of playing and adventuring together, the small pig seemed nervous. Christopher Robin tried not to smile at Piglet, whose expression was far too big and serious for such a tiny creature. Held out a small bag. I made you a sack of 100-acre wood acorns, he stammered. They are my very favorite snack. Wherever you go, they will remind you of the 100-acre wood. Christopher Robin took the acorns solemnly. Thank you, Piglet, he said. The little creatures nodded, but didn't take their eyes off the sack of acorns. Would you like one? Christopher added, noting the hungry way Piglet was eyeing the treats. To his credit, Piglet shook his head, but his eyes stayed fixated on the bag. Well, I don't think I'll need any help remembering, but I shall treasure them always, Christopher finally said, giving Piglet another sincere thank you. He was trying desperately to stay happy. But seeing how sad his friends were and the trouble they had gone to give him a farewell picnic just made Christopher even sadder than he had been when he had woken that morning. The minutes leading up to when he had entered the wood that day had been utterly miserable. His mother had insisted he pack before he could play. Then she had told him to clean out his nursery and put his baby toys away, as he wouldn't need them now that he was a big boy attending big boy boarding school. Despite a lengthy and, in his mind, well-argued protest about the importance of keeping things as reminders, Mother wouldn't change her mind. So that had meant more time inside, sorting and putting things in storage. He hadn't even been able to enjoy his last lunch, even though it was his favorite, a peanut butter and banana honey sandwich, because Father had arrived with the car right in the middle and had started packing up all their luggage. There had been one brief moment when Christopher was sure they were going to leave before he could escape to the woods, but then thankfully Father had been distracted, pulled away to fix a broken pipe. Christopher had taken the chance and slipped away. Arriving in the wood, he had hoped to get a break from the sadness he felt, but instead he found himself saying goodbye and feeling all the weepier by the moment. Suddenly the air was knocked from his lungs as Tigger threw his arms around Christopher and squished his face right up against the boy's. I'm gonna miss you, I am, he said, bouncing up and down on his tail as he squeezed Christopher tight. Christopher couldn't help himself. He let out a laugh. Tigger was always good for a laugh, and he provided Christopher with the distraction he greatly needed. I'll miss you too, Tigger, Christopher said. Then he turned to the others, determined to make the best of the rest of the picnic. Now, come on, everyone. We still have pudding. The rest of the afternoon sped by in a flurry of pudding, playing, and feasting. As the sun sank lower and the woods grew darker, Christopher Robin's friends began to fall asleep, one by one, until soon the only two left awake were Christopher and Pooh. The others lay on or around the picnic table, peacefully slumbering, Well, most of them were peacefully slumbering. Even in his sleep, Tigger's feet and tail were in constant motion. Pooh's nose was buried in a pot of honey. Around him, already emptied of their contents, were 8 other pots. Most were tipped over, their insides honey-free, and even their outsides licked completely clean. Pooh felt a party was not a party without honey. Lots and lots of honey. And he would never let any of the sweet goodness go to waste. Come on, Pooh. Christopher's voice startled the bear, and he pulled his nose free from the pot. Christopher Robin was on his feet, standing by the edge of the clearing. Pooh got to his feet and scampered, or rather waddled, as fast as he could over to his friend. "Where are we going, Christopher Robin?" he asked. In the light of the setting sun, the little boy's hair seemed redder than usual. In the wake of the excitement from the day, his cheeks looked flushed, while his freckles stood out. His yellow shirt, which had been clean when he had arrived in the wood, was now stained from pudding and grass and various other party fun. Even the shirt's stiff white collar was sagging despite the long day. Christopher's brown eyes were shining and bright. "Nowhere," he said, finally answering Pooh. "One of my favorite places," Pooh replied happily. Reaching up his paw, he waited for Christopher Robin to take it. The friends then turned and headed deeper into the woods together. They walked in silence for a while, each happy to just be with the other as they went. They recounted many of the adventures they had been on, often passing. Sights that triggered fond memories. They saw the tree where Pooh had tried to trick some honeybees by pretending to be a rain cloud, only to end up landing, along with Christopher Robin, in a mud hole. They walked by Rabbit's house where Pooh had gotten stuck, then meandered under Owl's old home, which had once blown down in a storm. Finally, they arrived in the large meadow hidden deep within the 100-acre wood. The sun was hovering over the horizon, turning the green grass gold. As the two friends crossed the meadow and towards Pooh's stick bridge, Christopher Robin looked down at his friend and asked, "What do you like doing best in the world, Pooh?" "Well, what I like best." He stopped and thought for a moment, tapping a finger against his chin. He furrowed his eyebrows, or he furrowed his brow and made thinking noises. Think, 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 think. Arriving at an answer, he began again. "Well, what I like best is me, and Piglet going to see you, and you saying, 'What about a little something?' And me saying, 'Well, I shouldn't mind a little something,' and it being a hummy sort of day outside." Pooh looked up, proud of his answer. Christopher Robin nodded but didn't say anything else until they arrived at Pooh's stick bridge. Peering over the edge of the bridge into the water below, he gazed at his reflection. He certainly didn't look any older than he had at the beginning of the summer, but his mother kept telling him he was a big boy now and that he had to act like one. He wasn't sure what that exactly meant, but he didn't think he liked it. "What I like doing best is nothing," he said finally. Pooh cocked his head. "How do you do nothing?" he asked, confused. "It's when people call out, 'What are you going to do, Christopher Robin?' and you say, 'Oh, nothing,' then you go do it." He answered as though That were the most obvious answer in the world, the whole world. Pooh's eyes grew wide as understanding dawned. Ah, yes, he cried. Doing nothing often leads to the very best something, he said. So Pooh says, doing nothing often leads to the very best something, he said. Delighted that they understood one another's favorite things, the pair moved on. While he hadn't intended to, Christopher realized he was taking a farewell tour of his favorite spots in the 100-acre wood. The meadow, Pooh's stick bridge, the woods themselves, they all held such precious memories of the many adventures he had been on with his best friend. But none of them were as special to him as the enchanted place, the spot they finally arrived at just as the last rays of sun snuck out over the horizon. Below them, a valley stretched, its bottom already dark in the early evening. Looking out, Christopher felt his stomach drop as deep as the valley floor. He could walk all he wanted, but there was no denying what was to come. He let out a sigh, and that was sadder and longer than even Eeyore's saddest and longest sigh. Pooh, he said, turning to his friend, I'm not going to do nothing anymore. The word struck Pooh like a slap to the face. Never again? He said in disbelief. Christopher Robin shook his head. Well, they don't let you in boarding school. As he spoke, he started to sit down. He let out a yelp. Acorns hurt? Pooh asked, assuming Christopher's response was to a loose acorn that his backside had accidentally landed on. Christopher Robin reached in his back pocket of his shorts, pulling out the bag of acorns Piglet had given him. Only when you sit on them, he said with a wry smile. I'll have to remember that, Pooh said, nodding at Christopher's wisdom. Looking over, Pooh saw that his friend's face was sad. He wondered if it had anything to do with the boarding school he had mentioned. It's a boarding school. Pooh had never heard of a boarding school before. Christopher had mentioned school, but that was a fun place where someone read you stories and you got to play with new toys and be with your friends. And boarding school didn't sound as fun. From the sound of Christopher's voice, it actually seemed like a very unfun place. Pooh didn't like to think of his friends stuck in a place that wasn't fun or nice. Just then, Christopher let out a sigh that seemed too big for such a small boy. Pooh, he said softly, his gaze trained on the meadow in front of him. When I'm off not doing nothing, will you come up here sometimes? Pooh cocked his head. Just me? He asked. Where will you be? I'll be right here, Christopher answered, lifting his hand. He tapped Pooh's thinking spot, the side of his head with his finger. He'll be right here. Right there. I'm sorry, Pooh. I knocked you down. Oops. I knocked poor Pooh right off his seat. He wants to get closer so he can see. He's trying to help me read. So he's going to be right here. his thinking spot. The side of his head with his finger. That made sense to Pooh. And he nodded. Christopher was always in his thinking spot. That was where best friends were supposed to be, usually. But what could happen, or what should happen, if you forget about me? Pooh asked. The thought hitting him hard, he felt sick suddenly. Like when he discovered he had run out of honey, or when he ate too much honey at once. Christopher reached over and put his arm around Pooh's shoulder. I won't ever forget you, he said softly. I promise. Not even when I'm 100. Pooh frowned in concentration as he tried to calculate how old he would be when Christopher Robin was that old. His frown grew deeper and deeper until finally he realized he couldn't figure it out himself and just asked. 99, Christopher replied, smiling. Slowly the boy got to his feet beside him. Pooh did the same. The sun had long since set, while he had done his best to avoid it. He couldn't delay the inevitable. It was time for him to leave the 100-acre wood. His mother and father had made it clear it was time to grow up. But as he looked around the place that had provided him with adventures and friends, he couldn't help wondering why growing up meant saying goodbye to the things he loved most. Christopher tugged at the starched white collar around his neck. It felt like it was choking him. Everything about his new school uniform felt like it was choking him. Actually, the awful-looking thing, with its pressed pants and stiff jacket, complete with big, ugly, round buttons, had been waiting for him on his bed when he arrived home the night before from his final trip to the 100-acre wood, along with the instruction to try it on to ensure the fit. An empty suitcase had been sitting next to the uniform with yet more instructions that simply read, pack. While he had hoped that staying in the woods until nightfall would save him from the final round of packing, he had been wrong. Christopher had arrived home to a nasty dinner, a hasty dinner, and was then sent to bed with a warning that they would be leaving early the next morning, and that his room better be emptied and his bags fully packed by then. Reaching his room, he hadn't had the heart or the energy to pack that night. Instead, falling into bed and burying his head in the pillow, flopping over, he had seen a shooting star in the sky through his window and made a desperate wish that the morning would bring a change in his parents' hearts. But sadly, that had not been the case. Instead of rising to the hoped for news that he was no longer going to boarding school, he had been awakened by his mother's frantic shouts for him to hurry. He could hear his parents as they moved about the house below, checking to be sure that they had gotten everything they would need. It was unclear when they would be back next. Mr. Robin's job was growing increasingly more demanding. And with Christopher off at boarding school, the house could very well go empty until the following summer, if Christopher was that lucky. Christopher's son, let's go. Christopher's shoulders tensed at his father's voice. It was rare for the man to talk to him directly, leaving that up to Mrs. Robin for the most part. But ever since they had informed him that he would be going to boarding school, Christopher had seen a change in how his father treated him. It was almost like he no longer thought of Christopher as a baby. Babies being the wife's domain, in Mr. Robin's opinion, but rather as a grown-up. He had even on occasion tried to engage Christopher in conversations, telling him about things that went on at his job, are just what excuse me, had happened on the ride to the country that particular visit. There was a part of Christopher that thought it was nice to have his father's attention for once, but there was another part of him that thought it was strange and uncomfortable. He had, in all honesty, grown used to being somewhat ignored by his father, especially when they were at the country house. That was part of what had sent him to the 100-acre wood in the first place. The house had always felt confining when his father was there for the weekends, and he had looked for a place to escape, where he could make noise and have fun without fear of his father getting upset. "Christopher!" His father's voice called out again, less comforting this time. Grabbing the suitcase off his bed, Christopher took one last look around his room. He said a silent goodbye to the toys on the shelves and the warm bookcase, and a farewell to the pictures on the wall. He nodded to the collection of stuffed animals on the single chair in one corner, his eyes lingering on the stuffed bear with the red shirt. Then he left the room, shutting the door behind him. Downstairs, the front door in the house was open, revealing a car sitting in the driveway. His father and mother stood beside him. While mere inches from each other, they seemed miles apart. Their eyes were gazing in opposite directions. Mr. Robbins was glued to the paper in his hand. Mrs. Robbins were glued to the paper in his hand. Mrs. Robbins were raised up staring at Mr. Robbins were glued, but Mrs. Robbins were raised up staring at the fluffy white clouds as they drifted through the blue sky. But upon hearing their son's footsteps, their gazes swiftly swung toward him. "Do you have everything?" Mrs. Robbins asked as her husband took the suitcase from Christopher's hand and placed it in the boot of the car. Christopher shrugged. "Then we're off," Mr. Robin said, sliding into the back seat and gesturing for the rest of the family to do the same. Catching sight of his son's sad expression, he reached over and ruffled Christopher's hair. "Don't worry, son," he said, the reassuring words sounding odd coming from the large man's stern face. "Boarding school will be a grand adventure, I promise you." As the car began to move down the long driveway, Christopher didn't dare speak. Grand adventure? Boarding school was not going to be a grand adventure. Grand adventures were running through the 100-acre wood. Grand adventures were laying traps for the heffalump. Grand adventures were scaling trees for honey. But as their country house faded from view, Christopher knew there was no use trying to tell his father any of that. He was going off to boarding school and leaving his friends and adventures behind, possibly forever. Christopher stared down at the blank page in front of him. He was supposed to be filling it with numbers, doing arithmetic, but he found himself doodling pictures of Pooh instead. He had been at boarding school for exactly 21 days, 4 hours, and he risked being caught taking a glance at the large clock that hung above the blackboard. 4 minutes. And each one of those days, hours and minutes, had been unbearable. Every morning, the students were awakened at 7 a.m. on the dot and expected down in the large dining hall by 7:30 for what usually consisted of a tasteless porridge and tea. The teachers sat on a platform above the students, their plates heaped with things that actually smelled delicious: waffles and bacon and fresh cream and sweet fruit. This ritual only served to make their own food seem that much blander in comparison. Then it was off to classes that lasted through the afternoon, long, dull classes held in lifeless rooms. Large windows offered a glimpse of the beautiful manicured grounds that surrounded the school, but the only time Christopher got to actually enjoy them was during their recreation period. Unlike the other classes, they seemed endless. The recreation class was short and typically only allowed for a few laps around one of the large fields before the boys were sent back inside. You need your shirt pulled down, Pooh? Here, is that better? Yeah, okay. His father's promise that school would be an adventure was proving, as Christopher had suspected, to be woefully wrong. When they had first pulled onto the grounds and he had caught sight of the handful of young boys such as himself, he had a brief flare of hope that maybe his father would be right. The boys all seemed about his age, and most wore the same dazed expression he knew covered his own face. But his hope had been short-lived. Moving into the room he shared with two other boys, Christopher had quickly discovered that most of the boys who were students at the prestigious boarding school were dull and lifeless, like the school itself. When he had pulled out a few of his childhood books to put on the shelf above his bed, his roommates had immediately begun to tease him, calling him a baby and asking if he needed a hug from his mommy. Probably. Mommies give the best hugs. The books were hastily removed from the shelf and crammed under his bed, along with the few stuffed animals he had brought. Since then, the teasing had only grown worse. While Christopher had spent much of his first 7 years at his family's country home and had been tutored by the kind governesses, the boys he now called his classmates had grown up being groomed to attend Grayford Prep. They were mean and cruel, and Christopher thought in his angrier moments not at all the types who would be invited into the 100-acre wood. He had tried his best to stay positive and find the bright side, just like Pooh would have done. That's what Pooh would have done. But in each passing day, it was growing harder and harder. He wanted nothing more than to go back and see his friends and tell them how horrible it was being stuck behind the large wrought iron gates of the school, but he couldn't. Instead, he had learned to just keep his nose in his books, try to forget about the 100-acre wood, and not bring too much attention to himself. If he did that, he had discovered he was able to go pretty much unnoticed. Unfortunately, it didn't always work. Sometimes he just needed to see Pooh again. So sometimes he drew, "Am I boring you, Mr. Robin? Am I boring you, Mr. Robin?" Probably. The teacher's voice, dangerously close, startled Christopher, and he looked up from the paper in front of him. He swallowed. The teacher was standing over him, a stern look on his face. In her hand, she held a long ruler. She began to hit it against her other hand, the sound loud in the now silent room. Then with a whack, she slammed the ruler down on the paper, the long rod landing right on the largest image of Pooh. The bear was leaning up against a tree, his hand in a honey pot, with a look of concentration on his gentle face. "I suggest you open your textbook, Mr. Robin, and follow along," the teacher said, doing it for him. The sudden movement sent the drawing floating to the floor. Tapping one of the math problems, the teacher raised an eyebrow and then, turning, headed back to the front of the room to resume her lecturing. As she walked away, Christopher tried to reach down and rescue the picture, but before his fingers could grasp it, The student across from him snatched it up. He looked down at the picture and sneered. "Nice bear, baby," he hissed just loud enough for Christopher to hear. Then, with a look of pure evil, he crumpled up the drawing. Christopher turned his face, hoping the bully wouldn't see the tears that threatened to spill down his cheeks. He knew it was only a drawing, but it was a drawing of Pooh. He wondered as he looked out the window what the silly old bear would think of all this. Pooh had never met anyone he didn't like, well, except for maybe a heffalump. Though he had never actually met or seen a heffalump, Christopher smiled. The bear would probably end up liking the heffalump. That was just the way he was. But even Pooh would probably not have liked the boys Christopher now found himself living with. Not for the first time, Christopher wished he could just go find his friend and leave this place for good. But as the teacher continued to teach the day's math lesson, Christopher realized with a start that it was a foolish wish. He had not wanted to admit it, but he had now known since the day he arrived that that part of his life was over. He was, as his father had said when he dropped him off, a young man now. It was his job to learn so that one day he could get a job and provide for his own family. Adventures in the woods and fun with his friends were a part of his childhood. If he wanted to ever fit in at Grayford Prep, he was going to have to put Thoughts of Pooh in the 100-acre wood under his bed, along with the rest of his toys. I have to grow up, Christopher thought, bringing pencil to paper and beginning to copy down the math problem on the blackboard. As he wrote, he couldn't help glancing over at the crumpled drawing of Pooh, now lying beneath the feet of the bully. Already pencil marks were fading, covered over by scuff marks made by the other boys' shoes. By the end of the class, the image, along with Christopher's hopes for returning to the 100-acre wood, had all but faded completely away. Promise me you'll never forget me, because if I thought you would, I'd never leave. Amen. And that's where we leave off. And then the next time we'll be on chapter 5. Oop, that's chapter 6, too far. Oops, there it was. There's where we'll be next time, chapter 5. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I'll see you next time. Remember to grow your brain. Bye-bye.